Good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and on this Wednesday night, I'm joined by Dalia Gebrial. Dalia, how are you doing?
I'm good, Michael. Happy May Day. Happy International Workers' Day. Very big date here at Novara.
A very big day here at Novara, although of course we are all at work, as I suppose everyone is, because the bank holiday is on Monday. We had a conversation in the studio about whether to take the Monday off. Now, that is a bank holiday that Novara Media respects, but we decided with all the elections on tomorrow, and we'll be getting the results through the weekend. Maybe there'll be sort of rumors about Sunak standing down. We are going to do some overtime to come back to you on bank holiday, or May bank holiday as it's called, Labor Day, whatever we call it in this country, I don't know. Coming up later tonight, Netanyahu has released a menacing video amid rumors the ICC are considering issuing arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials. LBC have announced their replacement for Sangita Myska, who has disappeared from the airwaves after criticizing Israel. We talked about that on Monday. We've got an update for you today. And we'll be joined by independent candidate for mayor of the Northeast, Jamie Driscoll, ahead of tomorrow's election. Students from universities across the United States have been protesting in solidarity with Gaza, but college administrators have been determined to shut them down. At UCLA, university officials declared yesterday that the pro-Palestinian encampment there was unlawful and in violation of university policy. That's when a group of pro-Israel counter-demonstrators decided to take the law into their own hands. Just before midnight, a large group of counter-protesters wearing hoods and masks arrived at the encampment, and it wasn't long before things turned violent. That was the moment pro-Israel demonstrators, or we should really call them a pro-Israel mob, fired a firework into the peace encampment. Now, it reportedly caused at least one student to be taken away for burns treatment. From there, the violence escalated. So the mob targeted the barricade the peaceful protesters had built around their encampment, tearing down parts of it. Some tried to force their way inside the camp. Then, shouting terrorists and second Nakba, the mob threw objects including pieces of wood and a metal barrier at those inside the encampment. The pro-Palestine protesters, some holding umbrellas and wearing helmets, gathered to protect the camp's perimeter against the intruders. And as the counter-protesters got closer to breaking through the perimeter and Palestine supporters attempted to keep them back, frequent fights broke out. According to reports, campus security guards watched on, doing nothing to stop the violence. Almost 2 hours after the violence began, Los Angeles riot police arrived at the scene with the pro-Israel mob shouting USA and applauding as they approached, but it would be a further hour before police intervened, threatening the counter-protesters with arrest if they failed to leave the area. Some of the pro-Palestine campers gave journalists their account of what happened.
One of my friends has a massive bump on the back of his head. He just got whacked when he was up here. I mean, they were coming up here and just like violently attacking us. It was honestly something that I'm kind of annoyed at myself for not seeing it coming, but I just didn't think that it would ever escalate to this level where our protest is met by counter-protesters who are violently hurting us, inflicting pain on us when we are not doing anything to them.
I think it's ridiculous. We have been here this whole time. We were just standing right in front of our encampment, which is a right that we have, and we got pushed from all the way over there to over here. But prior to that, we had people mazing us, beating us with bats and sticks, throwing whatever they could to us, and none of this law enforcement was here at all. So it's kind of disappointing that we're seen as the perpetrators here.
I think that it's kind of foolish that law enforcement didn't decide to step in when people were being beaten with metal bats, maced, yelling very threatening things, very disgusting things, when in reality, everybody that's in the encampment, that's not what they're there for. It has been a peaceful protest. And the fact that they're just stepping in now, it doesn't make any sense, because where were they when there was actual violence?
Counter-protesters also spoke to the press, giving their reasons for being there.
This is not right. Get them out of here.
This is Soros. This is how the Holocaust started. They don't let Jewish students get an education.
We're not going to let our ancestors' history repeat. You gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. The creator of heaven and earth gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people for an eternal inheritance. That's not Zionism, that's Judaism. This is Jewish identity that they're at war with.
That was a very extreme sounding man. Of course, their action was rather extreme as well. So starting fights, throwing fireworks. The violence at UCLA is the worst seen so far on a US campus during this wave of protests. Meanwhile, in New York, though, it's the heavy-handed approach of Columbia administrators and police that has garnered the most attention. On Tuesday, dozens of students occupied a Columbia building after the university's president announced that it would not divest from Israel. The building is itself significant, called Hamilton Hall, but renamed Hind Hall by protesters in memory of the 6-year-old Gazan girl killed under IDF fire. The building has a history of occupations, including in 1968 by anti-Vietnam War protesters. On Tuesday night, university administrators called in the NYPD to clear away Columbia's encampment and arrest the students occupying the hall. Riot police also appeared at the scene. They arrived in this armored vehicle equipped with a bridging mechanism. They used it to break into the second floor of the hall, where they also deployed flashbangs to disperse those inside. They went on to make several arrests, leading students in handcuffs to buses waiting outside the campus. Police say they'll be charged with burglary in the 3rd degree, criminal mischief, and trespassing. One of those arrested took to Twitter to give her account of events. So she said, just got out of jail after being arrested 12 hours ago, this time for protesting outside the gates of my own campus. I was thrown onto the ground and pinned down by 6 to 7 cops after having my phone knocked out of my hand because the cop got mad I was live streaming it. NYPD forcibly removed hijabs from multiple Muslim Columbia students in jail. We kept chanting, "Let her wear her hijab," over and over from inside our cells. One of them was told to shut up by an officer when she demanded to get back her hijab. Columbia unleashed these pigs on us. I'm referring to the cops, of course. Columbia's president has asked the police to stay on campus until the 17th of May. So she doesn't want this to sort of happen again, where you get this process of people starting an encampment and then her calling in the cops. She's saying, you guys need to stay here for the next couple of weeks to stop an encampment starting in the first place. And this is how she justified calling in the NYPD to clear out pro-Palestine protesters. So Manoush Shafiq, president of Columbia, said, the events on campus last night have left us no choice. With the support of the university's trustees, I have determined that the building occupation, the encampments, and related disruptions pose a clear and present danger to persons, property, and the substantial functioning of the university, and require the use of emergency authority to protect persons and property. Dalia, I mean, we're seeing some quite incredible scenes from the United States. Some people have probably seen on Twitter sort of videos of professors getting beaten as well. And really harsh action on these students in New York. And then the really shocking scenes of pro-Israel mobs essentially attacking pro-Palestinian students with little pushback from law enforcement. I mean, what do you make of all of this?
Yeah, I just want to begin by saying that it's hard to overstate how brave and commendable these students have been. They will be vindicated by history. They have put the so-called grown-ups in the room to shame. They have done more than so many of our, the very same liberal and right-wing press that has spent thousands and thousands of words trying to portray students as a threat to freedom, a threat to democracy, a threat to free speech, as kind of coddled babies. All those people have been shown up by the bravery and the commitment to justice, democracy, and freedom that these students have shown. I know that for many students, it will be very harrowing. Perhaps they didn't expect their administration to leave them so vulnerable to violence, to put them in harm's way in this manner. But we do know that, I mean, it was only in January, a few months ago, when pro-Israel whatever you want to call them, counter-protesters, thugs, whatever, sprayed protests in Colombia with an illegal chemical agent with skunk water, which is actually something that is used in the occupied territories. And the university administration was very slow and very hesitant to really take action. And so many of these students are aware of the personal risks they are undertaking, but they are driven by principle in order to take those risks for a greater cause. And I think it's incredibly commendable. I think the violence that we are seeing emanating from the police and from these vigilante pro-Israel groups, which, by the way, these two forms of violence are deeply interconnected. What we have seen here is this recurrent pattern of the administration sanctioning and calling upon police to behave in undoubtedly and unquestionably disproportionate ways, to be extremely violent towards protesters with little sanction or discouragement or condemnation from their administration. And then that sends the signal. These vigilante groups, which we know exist, have a track record of coming in and being violently disruptive to peaceful protesters. It gives a green light to those people that these students are fair game. You can come and you can throw fireworks into these student encampments. You can throw skunk water into these student encampments. You can beat people up. You can physically assault people. We have already sanctioned that these groups of students are fair game, that you can do as you want to them and no one with power will stand up for them. That in fact, we as a university administration, who by the way have a duty of care to students, that we will not only fail to protect them, but we will sanction it and encourage it. And so it's not surprising to me that the police withdrew in those moments to allow vigilante groups to do as they please, because they had set the tone for basically the kinds of accountability that exist around violence towards these students. So the police violence and the vigilante violence, as well as the violence that is sanctioned by the university administration, these are all deeply interconnected and require one another in order to exist. But I also wanted to kind of speak to the very dystopian and disturbing invocations of safety that this kind of violence is done under the rubric of. We've seen from university administrators frequently this idea that the actions that they are taking is in the interests of protecting students or preserving safety. There are 45,000 Palestinians dead right now. There are Palestinians right now who are being buried alive under the rubble. And that violence that has happened to those Palestinians has been, the university is a key part of that supply chain. It offers research capacities, it offers investments, it offers all kinds of indirect and soft power cover for the Israeli state. And the idea that the students, the anti-war students who are protesting their and withdrawing consent from their university's complicity in this supply chain of violence, the idea that they are the threat to safety is beyond chilling. And I want to finish on just saying that we know that there is a difference between being safe and feeling safe. And the fact that for some students who perhaps do look at these encampments, and because of what they have been told about what Palestinian solidarity represents, because they have been told that the existence of Palestinians is violent in and of itself, maybe they do look at these encampments and feel genuinely unsafe or feel fear. But their ability to feel safe does not get prioritized over the material ability of those students in those encampments, many of whom will come from marginalized backgrounds because of the nature of, this struggle. Their ability to feel safe does not get prioritized over the material reality of whether or not those students are safe. And those students being body slammed by police, being denied access to their homes. Many of these universities who are sheltering, who have, these students live in dorms, are being denied access to their dorms where their belongings are. There was reports of one student in the Columbia encampment being denied access to their dorm to get medication, and reports are that they had a seizure as a result. Their ability to, when you have two groups and one group's ability to feel safe is triumphed violently over the ability of another group to be safe, that is the fundamental principle of apartheid. It is the fundamental principle of segregation. When you look at the Jim Crow South at Jim Crow US South, when you look at South African apartheid, that was always justified on the basis that segregation and apartheid and violence against one group and the violation, the very real violation of that group's safety is necessary to maintain the imagined safety or the felt safety of another more important group. So it's the same, this invocation of safety whilst imposing the most unimaginable and unjustifiable violence towards your own students is dystopian. It's Orwellian, for want of a better word. And I think it will be judged by history extremely harshly.
And I suppose that process you're describing requires a fair amount of exaggeration of the threat posed by pro-Palestine protesters. And I have to say, some of the reporting of the protests in the United States have been outright bizarre. On MSNBC's Morning Joe, a police officer provided this evidence that they were dealing not with students, but with professionals.
Tell us about this change.
Yeah, so when we entered Hamilton Hall, this is not what students bring to school. Okay, this is what professionals bring to campuses and universities. These are heavy industrial chains that were locked with bike locks. And this is what we encountered on every door inside of Hamilton Hall.
You even heard the host say, oh yeah, that is not the kind of thing that a student would have, right? That was in fact a pretty bog standard heavy duty bike lock. And what that officer showed looks a lot like this one sold by Kryptonite, right? Normal bike lock. And you can see, or can you guess in fact, where I found that image? Well, it was attached to a post from 2020 by the Columbia University Public Safety Department. So the post calls it Kryptonite's best lock, not even Superman can defeat. And it offers Columbia students a discount code. So that cop was sort of there on MSNBC, taken incredibly serious by the hosts of Morning Joe, saying this is evidence these people weren't students, because what kind of student would have this heavy-duty chain? Well, it's the kind of heavy-duty chain that Columbia University had been advertising to their students, and in fact giving them a discount code to buy. Completely ridiculous. Of course, though, it wasn't enough to stop the NYPD pulling this stunt at a press conference.
Of the city of New York will never be locked out, and we will always work together to keep our city safe.
It's a bike lock. Right, we'll never be locked out. We'll always stick together. These terrorists with this bike lock, which was advertised to them by the university. The actual mayor of New York was sitting next to that guy, right? These are supposed to be serious politicians, and they're waving around a bike lock saying, these people we're dealing with, they aren't just normal students who want peace in the Middle East. These are really violent, aggressive people, but our good, brave police went in there and kicked them out despite all of these, he's talking about it as if they're weapons, right? It's a bike lock. Completely bizarre. Of course, while it is sort of these protests in the United States that are most dramatic because of the scenes we're seeing, because of the repression and because of the vigilantism, there are lots of actions taking place in this country, in the United Kingdom. We will come back to those in one moment or slightly later in the show. For now, though, we'll go to a very different story. Mayoral races take place tomorrow in the West Midlands, Tees Valley, London, and 7 other metro districts. Most will see a Labour candidate pitched against a Tory one. But for the new job of Mayor of the North East, a different kind of contest is playing out. There, the fight is not between Labour and Tory, but Labour and former Labour. That's because Labour blocked the candidacy of the current Mayor of North Tyne, Jamie Driscoll, for the crime of appearing alongside Ken Loach. And now Driscoll is standing as an independent, and he's polling neck and neck with Labour's candidate for the job. Now, that Labour candidate is Kim McGuinness, and this is her pitch.
This May, for the first time, our region has the chance to elect a mayor that will create jobs, fix our broken transport system, and end the days of London taking our decisions for us. I want to make the North East a place where everyone has the opportunity to have a good job, safe, reliable, affordable public transport, and a region here where we finally commit to ending child poverty. That's why I'm standing to be your North East Mayor, with a plan to finally bring our public transport network back under public control, from buses to train stations, with a plan around our rivers and ports to make us the home of green energy, and to finally put our culture and sports, the pride that we have in this region, back on the national and international stage.
That was part of Kim McGuinness's campaign video. I'm delighted now to be joined by Jamie Driscoll. Thanks for joining us. I'm sure this is a very busy day for you, it's polling tomorrow. We spoke about your campaign on Monday, me and Ash. And after watching that video from your opponent, I have to say I'm struggling to work out the difference in what you're sort of offering when it comes to your headlines, right? So you both want to bring public transport into public ownership. She's talking about creating green jobs. You're talking about creating green jobs. How are you different? What's the big dividing lines in this election?
Well, primarily it comes down to numbers, facts, and money. We're seeing this right across politics. What did the Tories have? They're levelling up. So it's one thing to say, I will do all these wonderful things, but unless there's any money on it, unless there's any numbers on it, it's all just platitudes. And people can see that. That's why so many people are coming over to me. But then you dig down into the detail. I've got a track record. I've smashed every target on job creation by 300%. I've done it without putting up the council tax. I've massively increased the number of training courses. And for all the talk about child poverty, the Labour candidate is backing the 2-child benefit cap, a single policy which keeps 45,000 North East children in poverty, whereas I've actually run a child poverty prevention programme in 100 schools. So, yeah, it's can you deliver? We're talking there about a police and crime commissioner, and crime's rising in Northumbria while it's going down in the rest of England.
You were sort of saying that, this is just messaging unless you sort of put money to it, unless you put numbers to it. What money can you use? What is the money at your disposal if you were to sort of win this mayoralty?
So, yes, I've been North of Tyne Mayor for 5 years now. That was all negotiated before I was a politician. And that has a core budget of £20 million a year. That gets prorated up. So when I was running last time, made a manifesto pledge that I would renegotiate the deal and bring in the wider North East. I currently cover 44% of the population. And so that extra deal gives us transport powers, which we don't have at the moment. So all told, it's £6.1 billion. Some of that's over a longer period. So the mayor will have £2 billion in the 4-year term, the bulk of which is for transport. Some of it's re-announced existing money, like for potholes and things like that. But there is a very large amount of new money for transport, core functions. You can do whatever you want to do. I've run that child poverty prevention program, creating jobs with that, and money for skills training, and some for clearing brownfield sites and building new homes. So there is something we can do. Does it compensate for austerity? No, it doesn't.
And, I presume Labour aren't too happy with the fact that you're running as an independent. They blocked your candidacy, I think, for pretty spurious reasons. But now you've got it alone and you seem to be running them close. Has this been in any way a dirty campaign? I would imagine if I were the Labour Party in this situation, I would have seething hatred for you and might be inclined to sort of partake in some dirty tricks. What's been going on? What can you tell us about the nature of the campaign?
Yeah, I think the premise that you're talking about there, Michael, I think that needs unpicking a bit, because you say Labour as if it's a monolith. And of course, the vast majority of Labour Party members wanted me to be their candidate. There's a lot of the MPs, a very large number of the councillors. I think, although they've got these weird hostage videos, I am backing Kim McGuinness, and you see them sort of blinking in Morse code because they've been forced to do it by lotto. They've got no one out campaigning, almost. Whenever they do a photo, it's almost in single figures. I've got huge numbers of people, but a vast amount of cross-party support. And actually, it's been fairly clean. There's the odd thing that they put out with false information, claiming that it's a neck-and-neck race between them and the Tories. That is a direct lie, and the polling shows that. But to be honest, it's largely been devoid of any media interest. I think that's one of the key things in this. You started by mentioning the Tees Valley and the West Midlands. Now, Guardian, other papers have showed, look, here's the polling, how close it is in these areas. It's Labour-Tory. And there's a poll out there that says someone, an independent, is challenging Labour when Labour, 20 points ahead nationally, challenging them in their core heartlands, and it's neck and neck in the polls. and nobody's picked up on it. And I think a big part of that is that if it's not about the general election, nobody talks about it. We even put press releases out to people like The Guardian, the BBC, didn't pick a thing up.
Oh, that's interesting they didn't pick that up. We did it on Monday. I have to say we were maybe the exception. Has that polling been helpful? So I suppose, in case anyone didn't watch our show on Monday, More in Common have done polling, which puts you and Kim McGuinness sort of in a statistical tie. I think it's 35 and 33 or something. Was there an issue sort of where you were knocking on people's doors and they were saying, well, I want to keep the Tories out, so I'm going to vote Labour, and now they're a bit more willing to sort of take a punt and give you a go?
Yeah, exactly that. The vast majority of people who are engaged, I mean, there's going to be a 30-ish% turnout because, in effect, it's a local election, and I don't think anything's going to shift that too much. It's been unlike any other election campaign I've been involved in, and I've been involved in election campaigns since 1987, when I was first out door knocking to try and get Neil Kinnock to be Prime Minister. And this is really unusual, because every time any of our activists go out and are talking to people, whether it's on the street, social media, and they explain my track record, what happened, what I want to do, they say, oh yeah, that's great, because there is such a rejection of Westminster politics here in the Northeast. And there's two things that have come up. One is, but wouldn't it be good to have a Labour mayor and a Labour government? And then people look at actually how centralised the Labour government is, and I think that mayors don't actually have any influence on the Labour government. And I managed to get more money out of the Tories than any of the Tory mayors did, which is quite an achievement. So, my negotiating record's good. And the other part of it is people thinking, I just want the Tories out, let's not upset the apple cart. And now that polling's there are loads of people thinking, yeah, you know what, I'm actually free to vote for the candidate I want. And I think that is going to tip us over the line.
And finally, let's imagine you do win. In that situation, do you sort of reach out to the Labour Party and say, have you changed your mind? Do you want me back in the fold? Or do you sort of put two fingers up at them for blocking your candidacy in the first place?
There are options other than those two, Michael. So what I would do is there's going to be a general election later this year. I will meet with senior Tories, senior Labour, possibly even Mr. Sunak and Sir Keir themselves separately, and say, when the election's coming round, I will look at your policies, I will analyse them, I will run the numbers, and I will advocate for whichever policy split works best for the Northeast. I'll start a bidding war for what's going to be best for the Northeast between them.
Jamie Driscoll, thank you so much for joining me. I'll let you get back to the campaign. Good luck tomorrow.
Cheers, Michael.
Protests on US campuses have been attracting international attention. But here in the UK, May Day actions by workers in solidarity with Palestine have proved very disruptive too. Those were scenes outside the Department for Business and Trade in London today after hundreds of activists blockaded it, preventing civil servants from entering. Police have reportedly arrested 3 people. Organisers for Workers for a Free Palestine have dubbed the action, quote, a people's arms embargo, with one telling Novara media this: if arms company bosses and Britain's political elite won't impose an arms embargo, we the workers will enforce it from below. The Department for Business and Trade grants export licenses for the sale of weapons to Israel, a practice the government has refused to suspend. And the London action was just one part of a wave of coordinated actions across the country. At the Glasgow site of BAE Systems, a blockade shut down the factory where F-15 parts are made, preventing workers from coming in. Activists also shut down the 5 main gates into BAE's Lancashire factory, which reportedly manufactures the rear fuselages of F-35 fighter jets used by the IDF. A third BAE site in Wales, reportedly the UK's largest, has also been shut down. Dalia, these seem like pretty effective actions. If they're stopping sort of these businesses opening for the day. Of course, it is difficult, I think, to get public interest and sort of press coverage unless the police come and beat you up to some degree. In a way, while it must be incredibly sort of terrifying for the Gaza protesters in the United States, the overreaction from those university administrations has been very helpful in terms of getting publicity. But I suppose credit where it's due to these people protesting in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is going to happen. This is a very big shift. A very big rock needs to be shifted, and it's going to take all of us pushing it in all these different ways with different kinds of responses in order to push this rock down the hill, to use a kind of somewhat limited metaphor. But yeah, I mean, this is a perfect way, the only way actually that you can celebrate International Workers' Day or May Day, because this is about a recognition and an acknowledgement and a celebration of the power that workers hold, not only in their workplaces, not only in the economy, but in, geopolitically. Many of the kinds of geopolitical issues that arise, whether it's war, conflict, climate breakdown, all of these different things rely on worker consent in order to be able to go in one direction or another. And I think we've seen, and this, what better way on International Workers' Day than in the middle of a genocide to at least symbolically disrupt and materially disrupt the supply chain of genocide. It's kind of the only thing that you can do on this day and in this historical moment. But I think that this issue of the diversity of tactics is really important. And I think the last 6 months has been incredibly eye-opening, I think, for a lot of people about why diversity of tactics is important when it comes to building power and making change. Because we've seen a lot of institutional recognition of the atrocious human rights abuses that Israel is committing in Palestine right now. We've seen from the ICJ, we've seen from the ICC, we've seen from basically any reputable international human rights organization. We've seen that shift in public opinion, and I'm going to reference the UK and I'm going to reference Britain and the US here, not because the public in the US and Britain are inherently more important than the public anywhere else, but because the US and Britain has historically been the places that have been subject the most aggressively to Israeli propaganda. So the shift in public opinion, we have more than half of both the British population believe in suspending arms exports to Israel. Again, as well, over half of the population of the US disagree with Israel's actions in Palestine right now. Those shifts are really significant. And that kind of institutional and public recognition in these places signifies a bellwether shift. But we've also seen the fact that there is limitations to that, especially when you're dealing with a live genocide where every day that passes involves more deaths, it involves more destruction of infrastructure, it involves another step on this timeline of the elimination of Gaza as a Palestinian entity. And therefore, the successful completion of this genocide. When you have this urgent and time-sensitive risk, and yet we're seeing that this institutional recognition in the ICJ, the ICC, it's not materializing into an actual means to stop what is taking place. These kinds of the role of workers in being able to materially disrupt these supply chains, when, for example, port workers in India refuse to handle any cargo that is on the way to Israel, when energy workers in strategic energy exporting countries for Israel begin to become organized to stop handling, again, exports to Israel, these have material and far more rapid disruptions and represent a different kind of lever of power that is nonetheless incredibly important. So it's really important, sure, that we continue to go on these protests, that we continue to fight for institutional recognition of these struggles, but it is equally important that these other kinds of diversities of tactics, these pulling of these material levers of power, using using the power that workers have to express the majority opinion around this issue is incredibly important. And no empire has ever fallen without workers. At least in modern history, no empire has ever fallen without the organization of workers as part of that multi-sided struggle.
Israeli officials have been expressing fears that long overdue justice may soon find them. The International Criminal Court is reportedly considering issuing an arrest warrant for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as other Israeli leaders. That news led to this response from Netanyahu himself.
You have to hear this to believe this. The International Criminal Court in The Hague is contemplating issuing arrest warrants against senior Israeli government and military officials as war criminals. This would be an outrage of historic proportions. International bodies like the ICC arose in the wake of the Holocaust committed against the Jewish people. They were set up to prevent such horrors, to prevent future genocides. Yet now, the International Court is trying to put Israel in the dock. 80 years after the horrors of the Holocaust, the Jewish state calls on decent people everywhere to reject this outrage by the ICC, to stand with Israel as we fight the barbarians of Hamas in Iran and as we work to secure a more peaceful world.
Doesn't really get more kind of crude and cynical than that, does it? The ICC was set up, well, the ICC wasn't set up after the Holocaust. It was set up in sort of the 1990s, I think, very recently. But he's right, sort of this idea of genocide, we did get that after the Holocaust. But the idea that because Israel is a Jewish state and because Jews suffered under the Holocaust, you can't possibly accuse Israel of any war crimes whatsoever, to me just seems, I think to most people in the world, seems transparently ridiculous. And then at the end to call Hamas and Iran barbarians. Now, to me, that's verging on genocidal language. You know, you're dehumanizing, a whole people. Iran, many millions of people live there. You're calling them barbarians. Anyway, if the reports about the ICC are true, Netanyahu has every reason to be worried. Unlike the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, the ICC prosecutes individuals, not states. And while Israel, like its ally the US, has consistently refused to join the ICC, the court can still issue arrest warrants for Israelis when they commit crimes in states which are members. So since 2015, Palestine has been a member of the ICC. Now, if warrants are issued for Israeli officials, it would mean that all of the ICC's 124 member states would be obligated to arrest any of those officials if they entered their territory. In material terms, that would mean no more trips to Europe, including the United Kingdom, for Netanyahu and his cronies. But are these rumours true? Well, it's not very clear where they've come from, with Israeli media reports citing anonymous government officials as sources. And the ICC itself has said it won't comment on ongoing cases, referring to its investigation into potential Israeli war crimes in Palestine dating back to 2014. Now, that investigation has been ongoing since 2021. Last November, ICC Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan confirmed that the remit of that existing investigation would be expanded to include Israel's assault on Gaza. And on Tuesday, Reuters reported this: ICC war crimes prosecutors have been questioning staff at the Shifa and Nasser hospitals in Gaza. Both of those facilities were held under siege by the IDF, and mass graves have been discovered in the grounds of each. But the ICC is not a court that moves quickly, and the US appears to be making every effort to slow their investigation down. This was State Department spokesperson Vedant Patel responding to the reports.
But the crux of this for the United States is that we do not believe that the ICC has jurisdiction on this. That being said, we work closely with the ICC in a number of key areas. We think that they do important work as it relates to Ukraine, Darfur, Sudan. But again, on this particular instance, they just do not have jurisdiction.
So we like the ICC when they're sort of doing stuff in Ukraine. We like it when they're doing stuff in Sudan. You know, we're all in favor of international law, just not in Israel. Or America, by the way. They're not signed up either. I assume sort of the legalistic debate from the Americans is that they don't recognize Palestine as being a member state of the ICC because they don't recognize Palestine as a state. Now, obviously, if the ICC has accepted Palestine as a state, then it does follow that according to the ICC's treaty, the Treaty of Rome, it has jurisdiction over what goes on in Palestine. So the United States don't get to sort of unilaterally decide, oh, the ICC might have accepted Palestine as a member, but we don't accept that the ICC has accepted, or that we don't accept the ICC can accept Palestine. It seems very much like you're making up rules as you go along. But this is bipartisan, of course, in the United States. The Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives has commented saying this: "It is disgraceful that the International Criminal Court is reportedly planning to issue baseless and illegitimate arrest warrants against Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and other senior Israeli officials. Such a lawless action by the ICC would directly undermine US national security interests, which surely should be the root of international law. If unchallenged by the Biden administration, the ICC could create and assume unprecedented power to issue arrest warrants against American political leaders, American diplomats, and American military personnel, thereby endangering our country's sovereign authority." Very, very strange logic there, isn't it? This is a completely lawless action, and it's a lawless action because it could implicate the United States. And that's not how the law works. Axios has even reported that Netanyahu has personally asked US President Joe Biden to intervene in the court on his behalf. Now, the US line coming out about the ICC and Israel stands in stark contrast to its view on the court just a year ago. This was Biden speaking to reporters in March last year.
Give us your reaction to the International Criminal Court issuing an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin.
Well, I think it's justified, but the question is, it's not recognized internationally by us either. But I think it makes a very strong point.
Provide information to the ICC.
War crimes in Ukraine. He's clearly committed war crimes. Thank you.
It's actually a really funny video for a number of reasons. The way he says, yeah, I'm glad the ICC have put out this arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. I mean, the thing is, we don't even recognize the ICC. So, I mean, who am I to say? But yeah, I'm kind of in favor. It was almost a bit more honest than I was actually expecting to see from Joe Biden there. Of course, there he was saying, you know, we're not a member of the ICC, but I support it. Now they're saying we're not a member of the ICC, and it's absolutely outrageous. You know, so they have a much stronger opinion now than they did then. The hypocrisy from the United States hasn't gone unnoticed. Russia's foreign ministry spokesperson has called the US's position intellectually absurd. If the ICC does issue arrest warrants for Israeli officials, that would be a pretty big deal. After decades of human rights abuses and potential war crimes against Palestinians, no Israeli has ever faced international justice. An arrest warrant for Israel's prime minister could result in arms embargoes and economic sanctions against the country. But amplifying the threat of impending warrants may also serve Netanyahu. By restating rumors of imminent arrests, he's prompted the Americans to rally around him. They don't want the ICC going after a key ally. Whatever the ICC might find, the United States would, of course, be complicit. Dalia, what do you think is going on here? Sort of rumors about an imminent arrest of, well, not an arrest, an imminent issuance of an arrest warrant for Netanyahu. But the rumors seem to be coming from the Israelis, which is somewhat bizarre situation, perhaps, or somewhat curious situation, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, as you rightly identified, in a way, a kind of political theatre, which Netanyahu is very well versed in, to essentially consolidate or reinvigorate the kind of the closing in of his allies and prompting his allies to defend him, to issue a defense, despite him being currently pretty indefensible. I think even many staunch supporters of Israel would say that Netanyahu is a problem, has gone too far. Now, obviously, I would disagree with that analysis. I don't think that this is a problem that is specific. The kind of violence that we're seeing is specific to Netanyahu. It is a kind of violence that has been present throughout Israel's history. But even amongst that kind of consensus around Israel, there is, at least to an extent, a discomfort with Netanyahu personally. And so I think that this kind of preemptive, and this, perhaps there are whisperings that this might be happening, but I think the decision to draw attention to that rumor, to throw it out into the public sphere, is a way to provoke a consolidation of public support, a reinvigoration of that public support around him. And what I would say as well is that this kind of behavior that we are seeing right now coming from Netanyahu and others it really is the sign of an insecure regime. Despite the fact that they have overwhelming military might, overwhelming economic might, which they are completely unrestrained in their use of and their exploitation of, deep down, I think that the Israeli state is very insecure about what its political and reputational position when this genocide is over will look like. I don't think that they can see, even if they achieve it's unclear exactly what their military goal is. If we're going to say that their military goal is to clear Gaza of Palestinians, even if that is achieved, the kind of, reputation that they have spent a lot of years building as a tourist hub, as being the rose that blooms in the desert, as being the only democracy in the Middle East, that kind of goodwill, as it were, amongst Western populations, has been severely compromised by things like the ICJ ruling and by what everyone is witnessing happening in Palestine right now. And so we are seeing these kinds of these very insecure expressions coming from this regime because it doesn't know how it's going to reconcile the kind of identity it has tried to build up over the past several decades with the naked display of imperial violence that we have seen in the past 6 months that has again shifted public opinion even within two countries, Britain and the US, that have historically been quite aligned with Israel's political stances. And I think in particular, if I was Netanyahu, I would be looking at the kind of organization and commitment and determination that we are seeing on US campuses as a kind of bad omen for the Israeli regime, because whilst students aren't necessarily perfect mirrors of the society in which they exist, typically students do tend to be more progressive, they do tend to be more radical than the society in which they exist. Whilst they aren't perfect mirrors, they are bellwethers more often than not. And when you see this kind of this level of organization and cohesion and relentlessness in continuing to protest around an issue despite huge amounts of violence and oppression from their own state and their own universities, more often than not, it indicates that a significant shift in public opinion and a significant shift in the political norm is going to follow. When we look at things like anti-apartheid organizing on campuses, particularly in the US, when we look at anti-Vietnam War protests, when we look at civil rights protests, at that time, the students in that moment were always stigmatized and always repressed. But more often than not, within just a few years, the consensus shifted much closer to the position of those students than to the position of those who were stigmatizing those very students. And so the scale of organization and the clarity with which students on US campuses are organizing, but also students on campuses around the world, if I was Netanyahu and I was looking at that in light of what that has meant historically, I would be concerned that that was a bellwether for a much more entrenched and significant political shift that will ripple throughout the rest of society in the coming years.
We reported earlier this week on the case of the missing LBC presenter. Well, now, 2 weeks after disappearing from the airwaves, it's confirmed that Sangita Myska has been let go. Now, LBC say they've shaken up their weekend schedule and it doesn't have space for Myska. And so she will leave the station when her contract is up. And that means the 14th of April will have been her final show. And this will have been one of her very last interviews.
What Israel did by taking that action against Iran was escalate what is already an incredibly fragile situation.
Sangita, that's an outrageous framing of the reality.
It's not an outrageous framing. I've just been speaking to somebody who is a diplomat to Iran from the UK government. That's not an outrageous framing of it. What Israel did was strike what is considered in diplomatic circles the sovereign territory of Iran, whether we like it or not. No. And there was undoubtedly going to be a blowback. So did Israel game out what was going to happen next?
Firstly, I'm not going to speak directly to that strike. What I can say definitively, and this is why it's outrageous, I can say definitively is that that wasn't an embassy, it wasn't a consulate, it wasn't any type of diplomatic mission.
It's been widely reported as that. It's been
because that's what
reported
Iran
as that.
says. Because that's what Iran says. So would you like to copy and paste?
Are you suggesting every single news organization in the world has got that wrong?
No, I'm suggesting that the Iranians have an interest to say that that was a diplomatic mission when we know definitively it wasn't. Okay, because they then want to give you the response that you've just copied and pasted, with all due respect.
As we spoke about on Monday, it was a building attached to the Iranian embassy, right? This is not, it's just some random building, right? It was a consular building, part of their diplomatic mission. Of course, though, it seems giving Israeli officials tough interviews is a dangerous business, because that was Sangita Myska's last day on air. She's gone. So what about Sangita's replacement? Will they be equally tough on the Israelis? Well, Nick Ferrari announced the new hire this morning.
At last, I can announce Vanessa Feltz is coming to LBC.
Hooray!
Oh, Vanessa, my goodness me. I loved the comment that you've given. You liken it to a romance.
Isn't it? LBC have been wooing me with flowers, with fruit, with muffins. They've beseeched me. They've been on bended knee. And all these years I've resisted their blandishments. And today I've succumbed. They've got me. They've had me, finally.
Okay, well, as you smoke the cigarette and enjoy it, what is it that finally... What made you finally succumb?
You and I in the afterglow together, Nick Ferrari. This is what I've been dreaming of all my life. What made me succumb? Well, partly you. Obviously, I've been a secret listener all these years. Could never admit it because I was always working for some kind of rival station or other.
Yeah.
But obviously, LBC is definitely where it's at and has been for years and years. Finger on the pulse, throbbing heartbeat of the country. And obviously, I want to be part of that, don't I?
Now, undeniably, Vanessa Feltz is a well-respected veteran broadcaster. She's well qualified to host a show on LBC. But relevant for this sequence of events, she's also a big supporter of Israel. Since the start of the Gaza war, she has been one of the most high-profile attendees at pro-Israel demonstrations in London. And she's used her Talk TV platform to attack the BBC for not referring to Hamas as terrorists. And on the channel, she's also made it her job to defend Israel from scrutiny of their conduct in Gaza. This was how she interviewed Peter Oborne back in November.
More than 11,000 civilians dead, tens of thousands injured, maimed for life, traumatized. You listen to the genocidal talk from the senior Israeli politicians. It's completely baffling to people.
Isn't your description of genocidal talk actually not accurate? Because senior Israeli politicians don't talk about eradicating the Palestinian race. Far from it, not in the way that Hamas, of course, talks about eradicating Israel and every single Jew in the country. They don't do that. They talk about wiping out Hamas, the terrorist organization at whose center is the tenet that what they exist to do is wipe out Israel. And of course, all of this in response to an unprovoked massacre of innocents, including babies, children, young people at a festival. So the idea that there's genocidal talk by senior IDF members is not accurate or true, is it?
Sorry, I don't. Thanks for the lecture, Vanessa.
It's a pleasure.
I greatly enjoyed it. But if you just look at the comments made by the senior Israeli politicians, you know, what is it that Gallant said? He's talking about human animals. Listen to the words from Smotrich, who runs the West Bank. I mean, this is really terrifying stuff.
But they're not referring to Palestinian families or children or the babies in the hospitals for whom they were handing in incubators today, are they? They're not talking about them. They're talking about the terrorists who beheaded babies.
They're talking about the terrorists who beheaded babies. That completely debunked lie, right? Just... And by the way, if you're saying, oh, maybe she's just, she always plays devil's advocate and gives people very tough interviews. I watched actually today an interview she'd given to sort of an Israeli journalist who's very supportive of sort of the war on Gaza. It was not a tough interview, right? This is someone who gives pro-Palestinians very tough interviews and seems to give pro-Israelis pretty soft ones. And as I say there, she was basically repeating stuff which was untrue. Like if she's saying, hey, it's ridiculous to say they're using genocidal language. Well, many of the quotes, many of the people that Peter Oborne was referring to ended up in a ruling by the International Court of Justice saying these are the kind of statements that shouldn't be made. Right? So, she's trying to make out to her audience that this guy is some sort of extremist, someone who hasn't done their research, an ideologue, whereas Peter Oborn there was really just stating the facts in quite a matter-of-fact way. And she was sort of amplifying things that aren't true, like beheaded babies. Dalia, it's quite on the nose, isn't it? Sort of Sangita Myska out. Now, obviously, we can't confirm what the reason is, but we have shown you what her final interview on the station was, right? And the big new hire in, Vanessa Feltz. Yes, someone who, I'm sure they thought, oh, she's a good high-quality broadcaster. People recognize her voice. But in the situation we're currently in, they seem to have got rid of someone who is a very strong, supportive, or, a tough voice when it comes to Israel, and replace them with someone who's a very soft voice when it comes to Israel.
Yeah, and I mean, if I was Sangita watching the framing of Vanessa Feltz's introduction into LBC, I would be feeling extremely jaded. The difference in how, editorial treats people on different, not even different. I don't even think it's accurate to say that Sangita falls on a particular side, because the question that she asked, she was invoking the widespread understanding, which, the person that she was interviewing was trying to imply that somehow every news outlet in the world was an arm of the Iranian government's propaganda wing and is willing to lie on behalf of the Iranian state, which makes absolutely no sense. She was asking a question that basically any journalist worth their salt should have been asking, which is when you attack which is that consulates, embassies have a protected status in diplomatic circles. They are considered sovereign territory. When they are attacked, this is considered to be a declaration of war. And so let's have a conversation about that. So it's very very, surgical and precise language that she was used, very careful language that was used, and how she is basically shelved in this deeply disrespectful way, compared to the very haphazard and chaotic way in which, to put it very mildly, to put it very generously, that Vanessa Feltz approaches this issue in a way that basically doesn't take into account credible sources. For example, the fact that the ICJ accepted and issued a caution against the people in the high levels of the Israeli state from using genocidal language, the repeated times in which the UN has warned against the kind of genocidal and dehumanizing language that the Israeli state uses against Palestinians, and of course, uncritically spreading the debunked lie that Hamas beheaded babies. So this kind of very sloppy journalism that Vanessa Feltz represents around this issue, this deliberately sloppy journalism that Vanessa Feltz engages in here, I would argue, is the red carpet is rolled out for her. She talks about being sent fruit baskets and being wooed and being begged to come onto LBC. Meanwhile, another journalist who asked a question that was incredibly precise and incredibly well backed up and incredibly reasonable, is basically treated as disposable and, is loses her job as a result. And it just goes to show how so many of these radio stations that claim to be this neutral space for free debate and free speech are in fact deeply invested in setting the parameters around what kinds of speech are acceptable and what kinds of speech are not. And the remit and the range of journalistic practices that are allowed on that platform is incredibly narrow. They are far more harsh on people from, whether it's trans people, migrants, refugees, whatever scapegoated minority it is of the day. They are far more harsh. You were meant to be far more harsh on LBC as a journalist, apparently, on those people than you are on literal representatives of government. That is not what serious journalism is about. And I think that the difference in treatment between and the difference in reward structure between the very haphazard representation of things that Vanessa Feltz engaged in versus Sangita does really speak to the fact that these are not just neutral platforms of free speech and free debate and exchange, but they are, you know, they are entities that ideologically structure public debate and public discourse within quite clearly delineated boundaries.
I mean, we should say, just because it's always risky to impute motives, I'm sure Vanessa Feltz would deny that she intentionally does sort of shoddy journalism when it comes to Israel. But I mean, I think the clear effect of the clip that we just showed you there was that she was massively amplifying Israeli talking points and massively sort of dismissing, you know, what I think to be the truth about Palestine. So it clearly has that effect, doesn't it? And I totally agree with sort of what you're saying there about reward structures, Dalia. Very interesting, actually, how, you know, there was a journalist, Natasha Devon, also on LBC, who spoke. She was speaking to a caller, and she did actually misspeak, because she sort of said there are some academics saying there's no evidence of any sexual assaults whatsoever. And I think she would have been more correct to say there's no evidence of systematic sexual assaults. There is evidence of sexual assaults, but I think lots of the journalism around it was very shoddy and was exaggerated. That doesn't mean what happened was not awful. But she has to put out this very lengthy apology. I haven't seen anyone put out a lengthy apology for repeating the claim that Hamas beheaded babies when it's not true, right? So you only seem to have to apologize if you get things slightly wrong in one direction. If you get things very wrong, and your talking point happened to be helpful to the Israelis, I haven't seen anyone have to apologize yet. Thank you for watching this evening. Come back tomorrow for another stream from 6 p.m. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.